Today I wanted to go over kind of a boots on the ground Vineyard Manager approach to where we're going mechanization wise, and it should really be mechanization and efficiency, because I think there's a lot of areas, whether you're big or small, where we can improve our efficiencies. And I wanted to look at kind of the past, where we've been, how it kind of got us to where we are now, and then maybe what the future will look like. And then in conjunction with that, it's like, what are some of the driving forces that are pushing us in one direction or another? What are some of the positives, like the technology rapidly advancing that's making all of our lives easier, and then what some of those barriers might be. And then I'm just going to take you on a personal journey on some of the things that we've learned, and show you some cool slides of some of the equipment we've used. My first job out of college was with a small consulting firm in Yountville. Yay, right? Good wines, nice vineyards, fancy restaurants, except I was working in Escalon, Fowler, Huron, Selma, Dinuba. Back in those days, we didn't have any fancy Agrion programs. We didn't have Ladybug, Tiger Jill. We had something called the CPR, and the reason it was called that is because if you had to carry it more from your truck to the office, you might need CPR. It was a big green book, and you had to open it up to look up the labels that you wanted. You had to hunt and peck for the REIs and the PHIs, and it was quite a time-consuming. You could spend as long writing your recs by hand as you did scouting the fields. But one of the interesting things that I learned is a lot of times the foreman or the vineyard person or the field person would want calibration in conjunction with the recommendation. So you're writing up not only the chemicals that you need them to use, but the gallons of water, the nozzles, the swirl plates. And so I learned a lot in the aspect that you're looking on all these different crops. It wasn't just wine grapes, it was tomatoes, cotton, tree fruit. And so you got a good idea in California how many different types of spray rigs and the way that people were getting their work done. And it was a valuable experience. I didn't realize it at the time. It was just a big pain, but it taught me a lot. So when I moved jobs, I ended up finally getting to work in Napa and Sonoma, but also on the Delta and in Lodi. And back then we were harvesting with the old upright harvesters, which were very slow, 3/4 of a mile an hour, and you had two guys in rain suits behind pulling out all the MOGs that the harvesters would keep running. And then you started to see some of the pull behind Gregoire technology, and those were nice, but there's two things that you have to think about when you're talking about those machines. One, you only use them one time a year, harvest. Two, even with the pull behinds, you still have two tractors because it's a discharge machine. It wasn't self-propelled or self-contained. About that same time, we were hearing about this really awesome machine being built by a guy in Paso named Matt Andros. And we're out harvesting on the east side of Lodi, and I really wanted to go see this thing. They said it looked like a tank. And I thought, wow, that's cool. So one night we're out there and get a phone call. Oh, this machine's over working in this field. So we run over there and we go, and machine's out there, but it's not moving. We walk up, and Matt's under the machine, and they're working on it, and everybody's standing around. Didn't want to get in the way, left. 2 nights later, same thing. Go back over, machine's not running. Matt's under the machine. Didn't want to get in the way, we left. About the 4th time, I'm over there, and I looked down, and I said, are we ever going to see this thing run? And he had this huge wrench in his hand, and I backed right up because he didn't want to hear that. So I never got to see that run. That was like 1998. And out on the Delta one morning, it's really foggy, and I look up and I see this, something I've never seen before. And it's this big tank machine out spraying, and it looks like it's spraying, 8 to 10 rows. And I thought, that's awesome. That's the wave of the future. So fast forward, the company I was working for also had a vineyard in Los Alamos, and I'm talking to the vineyard manager, and he said, oh, KJ's got one of those across the street. You want to see it work? So we walked over, and I finally got to see the thing harvest, and it was cool. It's something that was being done in 1996, 1997, and you would think there's got to be a ton of those things around. Unfortunately, there's not, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So this is a machine built in the late 90s that we're still using today. And while it's playing, I just want to show you the kind of the efficiencies built into this. But something to think about is when people are trying to come up with vineyard-specific equipment, you have to have a couple things in place. You have to have the infrastructure, meaning your vineyard needs to be set up for it. So you either have to design the machine around the vineyard or the vineyard around the machine or together. But you can't have a vineyard set up for this type of thing without knowing that you're going to be on 6-foot spacing, have your trellis set up completely right. Go ahead. There you go. So this is the Andros machine. We actually have what we call KJ1, 2, and 3 because they were the, I believe, first, second, and third built. And when you look at the way these vineyards were set up way back in the mid-90s, and with the idea of doing a lot of over-the-row, over-the-vine, high-density, highly efficient spraying, it's pretty amazing. And I mean, it's still quality-based, and we're not trying to cut corners, but all of these vineyards were set up like this. So when you have a machine like this going through the field, you're covering 75 to 85 acres in a shift compared to the Polancs, which are covering 40, compared to your Spectrums or your Aerofans, which are covering 20. So you have some real built-in efficiencies. The other thing I would say is back then, specifically talking about the Andros machines, is there was a lot of conversation, rightfully so, about the cost of the machine versus what else was out there. And you heard a lot of people talking about, I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, right? Because if this thing breaks down at harvest, if it breaks down during your spray season, then there is some logic to having multiple machines and some redundancy. However, looking back, if more people would have been out there supporting these machines are 20 years old. And a lot of the new machines that we have they're no longer serviceable. And these machines are used every day. They're used for spraying, they're used for harvesting. I have a cool video later to show you harvesting 2 rows at a time. So my point on this is there have been some cool things done in the past. And so I want to look a little bit later why we didn't follow through with that, or what some of the thinking was behind it, and maybe where some of that thinking will go in the future. So people have been hitting on a lot of these things that I want to cover, which is why mechanization. So there's forces that are pushing us towards mechanization that aren't just money or financially driven. You've got things that you can do in your vineyard that improve efficiency if you're mechanized. You've got ability to reduce costs. Obviously, if you're spraying with that big Andros, your costs go way down. That's one driver doing the work of 4 on a given shift. We need to start taking advantage of improvement in technology. And my point about the CPR book versus the Agrian systems that we have today is you can write 10 recs now, what used to take you, the same time to write 1. You have the ability to maximize your evolutions through the vineyard, and that's what I call my 2-for-1 pass. So if you're out there, the common example, which I'll show you later, is a berm sweep and a mower, but there's a lot of other things you can do now. And the other thing that we'll talk about a little more in depth that other people have hit on is the ability to utilize your personnel at their highest possible skill level. So, the days of having people out on an ATV checking drip are pretty much over. You need them multitasking and doing as many different things in the vineyard as they can, and I'll cover a little bit of that too. One of the things I think that's coming is when you look at who works in agriculture today, and we had a very good presentation last year here at the expo, which I found really fascinating because it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. You look at the demographics and the way things are going from our traditional labor force, and you realize that it's not going to be there. But there's some other things too that we need to look at. I think we all know that our workforce is aging pretty rapidly, and there's not a lot of people behind them. Any vineyard manager in this area or person that's responsible for hiring knows that during the winter you used to get so many interruptions that you would put out a flyer telling them how to apply because people would come by and it was whole crews coming by getting ready to prune. That hasn't happened in 8 years. You're lucky if you see one person. So the workforce is definitely not the same as it was, and it's been proven that they're aging and there are less people. In 2008, you have less than 2% of the population, and those numbers could be slightly off, but you get the idea that between 1870 and where we are today, we have very few people working direct farm. So my point in that is I don't think that we have a lot of people that understand where we are in our situation. They see that there's a lot of immigration, or there has been a lot of immigration, but the fact is we're losing people and we're going to have to mechanize in order to compensate for that. Looking around just town when you're driving, a lot of anecdotal stuff is we're getting to a place where at certain times of the year we're having a hard time filling in certain jobs, leafing, suckering. Those jobs used to be readily filled, and it was a good way to keep a lot of your people busy. Now you don't see that. You also are seeing a lot more H2A buses on the road, and you're seeing that supplemental labor come in. So it's a reality, I think, that a lot of people might want to ignore, but it's here. And 10 years from now, it's going to look completely different. So what I'm kind of advocating is really not, with no disrespect to any of the other speakers, but I think there's a way to mechanize a lot of these operations without compromising quality. And I don't think there's going to be a ton of people on the Central Coast converting to box pruning and doing some of the things that may make sense in other areas. So what we have to do is analyze our situation. And like Greg was talking on day one, a lot of times that just means sitting down and looking at how you're doing things and seeing where you can improve and what makes sense. The other part of that is going out and finding the technology that will match, the job that you need done. And sometimes you're going to have to build it or find someone to build it for you. So this is your traditional 2-for-1 berm sweep and mower. And these are things that a lot of growers have been doing in different iterations on a lot of different operations throughout their vineyard, but the principle is the same. If you can do 2 jobs at one time, it's better. It cuts down your drivers and it increases your efficiencies. So there was a lot of talk about why mechanization. This is another reason that I've found in our vineyards is we've been using Roundup on a lot of our blocks for a long time, and we were really defining a weed population that was becoming, I won't say resistant, but Roundup was not working super well. So we took a certain amount of acres and we started going through with Clemens, Polanc used to make something you might be familiar with that's called a sunflower that actually does a pretty good job when it runs through the field, and it gets all the weeds around the vine. But after about 3 years of doing this, what we found is we eliminated those problem weeds that Roundup was missing. So we didn't cut Roundup out of our program and go wholesale under vine cultivation, but where it makes sense, we've dedicated that equipment and that manpower to it to address a certain problem. So it's not always just dollars and cents or efficiency, but maybe it's a best practice for your farm and your vineyard. Okay, here's another specialty piece of equipment that we have. Some of you have seen, maybe some of you haven't. We call it the Crab, but it's a modified John Deere. And what I want to talk to you about with this, when it stops, and you'll be able to see it, if you can stop it, yeah. So you learn as you go, and some of the things we've learned is there's a lot of good leafers. The Clemens leafer that you previously saw in the other presentation is a good machine. But one of the things we find in our spacing and the way that we prune is that we don't get a really good job without the ability to pinch. So this Crab is interesting because you're able to set the drums on both sides of the vine, and you get a much better job going through and leafing. These machines, again, are about 20 years old, and some of the problems you have are just the basic infrastructure of the machine needs to be buttressed and welded and redone, but there is a life expectancy to every piece of equipment. And what I really want to say on that is the same thing with Andros and these pieces of equipment. Without the support, without the ability to produce enough units to make it worth being out in the field, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about equipment or irrigation technology, then that company won't stay in business. And that's kind of what we saw with the big Andros machines, is that there was a kind of a prohibitive cost to entry to those, and there was a unsuredness about putting all of your eggs in one basket. But now when you look back over the long term, it was a great investment. I mean, the only thing that's stopping us now from continuing to use these at harvest is the fact that the computer technology that runs these is now 20 years old and no longer functional. So, and there's wheel motors and there's things that people just no longer make because there's not enough units in the field to support them. I was having a conversation with somebody I really trust and admire, and he brought up a good point. He said, and I wrote this down because I didn't want to mess it up too bad here, but if you look at how many acres of wine grapes there are, let's just call it 1 million, 600,000 are wine grapes, and there's 150 or so of raisin and table. You look at wheat, you look at soybean, that's 88 million, 85 million, or wheat's 54 million. You've got 88 million of corn and 85 million of soybean. So my premise is that if you're going to look across the long term, to get those platforms we need for the technology, it's going to have to come from the bigger crops. They're going to have to develop that technology. And that may be whether it's sensors or cheaper getting enough of those components in the field that we can apply to the wine business. I think that's where the technology is going to come from. I think building specific equipment for a specific vineyard is inherently not going to work, because all of us out here are setting up our vineyards based on our site, our terroir, our goals of what we want to do. We're just not set up to have a one-size-fits-all. But with the rapid advancements in technology, I think that we'll be able to take some of that stuff and move it over, and it will become more efficient no matter what you want to do. So there will be components that fit that are coming from some of those other industries in ag. Anyway, this machine does a great job. It's been modified more than several times. The basic premise is to be able to leaf 2 rows at the same time. And with the improvement in leafer technologies, you take the old ones off and you put the new ones on. And so over the years, we've continued to improve to the point where we don't do a lot of hand leafing anymore. And it's extremely efficient. We could actually use 2 more of them as we've grown. Now we're at a point where we're really running the heck out of these things. The one thing I will say too is with the newer machines, we use a lot of Palanques in my area. And that's nice because the one thing that always used to drive me nuts is we would be out there and we'd harvest, and then we put all the harvesters away, and then we pull back out the tractors. Now at least we're getting to a point where we're using our machines for spraying. When it comes time to hedge, we put the hedgers on, we put the mowers behind the hedgers, and we're running through the field. When we're pre-pruning, and running mowers or Clemens or discs. And so you're getting a lot more work done in the field. Again, this comes back to less people, right? So if you had an irrigator on an ATV, that person's now on a Palanque machine, and he's out there and he's running multiple tasks through the field. So there's built-in efficiencies with that. When it comes to your cost savings, I didn't want to put any numbers in, but you can see that if you're, in the old days, you would go through with an 870 and a mower, and you would mow your rows 1 row at a time. Now you hook up 2 mowers on your Palanque and you put 2 Clemens on behind them. You're mowing and you're taking care of your weeds at the same time. There will come a point, hopefully, when they can make it fit to where you can hedge or leaf, mow, and Clemens at the same time. So that's where I see the big innovations taking place. It's really figuring out how to work multiple tasks in your vineyard and how to use your machines all year round to make it worth the investment. It's hard to spend $250,000 on a piece of equipment that sits for 6 months out of the year. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's where we put a lot of our focus. This is a Palanque. I know a lot of you have seen it. The reason I included this is, one, it's one of the only daytime videos I have. But the other one is because something that we've adopted and that's worked well for winemaking, because winemaking is what drives everything we do. You're able to use these self-propelled machines. And there's 2 good things about that, in my opinion. One, you don't have a tractor tied up following them in the field. So instead of having 7 tractors supporting 3 machines, those guys can sit on the edge of the rows. The machine calls them when they're done. They come in, they dump. You can dump into valley bins. You can dump into 1-ton 4x4 bins, or you can dump into, we have 3-ton, or 5 or 6-ton bins. So it makes it a lot more efficient. You're using a lot less people, and you're able to meet the winemaking qualities that the winemakers want. And it wasn't always real easy for us. When we first started, there was a lot of, we don't want machine, we want hand, we have this program, now everybody is completely comfortable with it because the machine technology has improved so much in the harvesting areas that it's great. Same thing with the sprayers. A lot of time the sprayers were, took a little tweaking, but now a lot of it's starting to get dialed in. Here's another one I have that kind of shows you the 2 different ways that the harvesters go through the field. And it may not seem like a big distinction, but in my mind it is, because you've got the Polancs out there working and they're self-contained, and then you'll see the Andros come into the machine, into the picture, and it's a 2-row harvester, so you have to have 4 or 5 gondola tractors rolling right alongside them, and it's just a different way of doing things, and it all depends on your operation and how big your blocks are, and whether you're on a hillside. Like, you're not going to run an Andros up and down a hill, so that's going to be a Polanc only, or Broud, or whatever you have. But on the big flat blocks, it's pretty efficient to be running a 2-row harvester, and he's not going 1 mile an hour. He's chugging through the field. That's 2 rows at a time. Yep. The last thing I want to touch on is just the efficiencies and logistics. A personal example is about 9 years ago, we put in a field press, and we used to have belt presses. I'm sure there's a couple of you out there that saw those and remember them. And it was not a super efficient way to do things. We were lucky enough to get these 3 50-ton DME presses. You know, one of the things that all vineyard managers dread is seeing that truck leave and go to the winery and not wondering when it's coming back, because that's the link in the chain that can really stop you from having an efficient harvest. So we put these in, we have a scale in the field, and we used to run 7 truck drivers and 7 trucks on average per night to get all of our grapes in, and that would be like a 500 to 700 ton night. Now we do it with 2. And all they do is run to the scale. We have an oversized receiver. You have to take 2 trucks at a time for 1 press. And from the time the guy jumps in the truck, goes across the scale, dumps, and comes back is about 12 minutes. So we went from being able to do, 300 tons a night on a big night in 12 hours to doing 500 to 700 tons a night in 10. So there's a lot of little things that you can do. That's not a little thing, but I mean, in your operation, you can think about ways to improve your efficiencies to make best use of your machinery and your manpower. There's also things at the wineries that a lot of the winemaking team can do, because saying that they just want hand picking is going to be very, very limited moving forward, and it may take 10 years, but my message to them is always, you need to get comfortable with the technology, because that's all you're going to have at some point, minus some very high premium end wines. So one of the things we have it's called a Monta sorter. It's a mechanical sorter, and once you get it dialed in, you can take stuff that's late harvest, Syrah blocks that have a lot of petioles. You run it through that thing, and you have almost 2 clean fruit. So whether it's in the vineyard or the winery, or just logistically looking at your operation, there's a lot of ways that you're going to be able to implement these changes and maximize the new technologies that are coming out to help make you more efficient. And it doesn't have to do with just mechanization, but I think that there's a lot of mechanization that needs to be implemented because of the changes that are coming. That's it.
Thank you, Bart.
You're welcome.